She dug her barn into the hill instead of building it on top. That was the whole of it, and the whole of why they laughed. Every sensible family in the kettle draw put their barns where God and habit said barns went, squared up on the flat, timber walls raised toward the sky, a good pitched roof to throw the snow. Mara Hope did the opposite. She cut a mouth into the south face of the ridge and hauled the dirt out by the barrowful, and she meant to keep her stock in the earth itself, under 3 feet of turned sod, through the worst the plains could send. The men who watched her said the ground would drown her animals in spring seep. They said dead air would smother them by February. They said she was burying good money in a grave she dug with her own hands. If it failed, she lost everything. The stock was the note was the land. The land was all that stood between her boy and a wagon back east to nothing. 6 weeks before she could prove any of it, the blizzard came early, and it came without warning. She was on her knees in the cut when the first cold front of it touched her neck. She had a hand auger biting into the hillside, boring the third of her ventilation channels, and she leaned her whole weight behind the crank the way a person leans into a stubborn cow. The bit chewed, grit spilled warm from the hole and cooled in her palm. She'd bored the first 2 channels low and near the floor, where fresh air would come in cold and heavy, and this third one high, at the back, where the fouled air would climb and leave. She had reasoned it out the way you reason out a chimney. Cold falls, warmth rises, and something in a shut room has to move or everything in it dies quiet. Behind her the hill held. That was the first surprise to anyone watching. The earth she'd cut did not slump. She had shored the mouth with a frame of squared cottonwood, and pitched the buried roof to a rise of 1 foot in 3, so the load overhead pressed down and outward into the ridge instead of straight onto her timbers. She checked the ridge pole with the flat of her hand. No give, no damp. She measured the sag with her husband's chalk line reel, letting the string fall plumb, reading the true against the string, and it read true. She wound the reel back slow. The brass was worn bright, where Tom's thumb had ridden it for 11 years. Tom had framed houses in Ohio before the fever took him in the second summer out here, took him fast, before the roof of their own first cabin was even shingled. She had watched him work enough to steal the grammar of it, load and thrust, plumb and level, the way weight wants to travel and where it wants to rest. She had no man now, and no money to hire one, and a note on the land that came due in spring, and she'd looked at the treeless draw and the killing winters, and done the arithmetic no one else would do. That timber above ground fought the cold and lost, but 3 feet of earth simply held it off. A house on the ground fights the winter, Tom used to say of the sod huts. She had turned it. A house in the ground lets the winter pass over it. She said it out loud sometimes, to the auger, to the cow, to no one. She fed the string back into the reel, and set it on the ledge she'd cut for it, and went back to the crank. The cow, Juno, watched her from the near stall. She had never once gone to the far one. By the time she'd hung the plank doors and forked in the first bedding, the 2 loudest men in the draw had ridden out to see the folly for themselves. Alder Vance came first, on a good horse, in a good coat, and he did his mocking with a pencil. He stood in the mouth of the cut and figured her costs aloud. 3 seasons of labor in the digging, he said, that she'd never earned back in saved feed. A pole barn would have cost her a month and $40 of sawn lumber. You've spent a year, he said, to save a winter. He was not cruel about it. He was a man who kept books, and the books did not lie, and by his books she had thrown away the one thing a widow could not spare, which was time. The Reverend Josiah Pruitt came behind him, and did his mocking with his eyes toward the ridge above her. He had left the pulpit for a plow, but never quite left the pulpit. He looked at the sod overhead and the dark mouth beneath it, and he did not like it. A man builds up, he said, toward the light. You've made a den. He meant it kindly, and he meant it entirely. To him a home pressed into the earth was a small blasphemy, a turning away, the shape of a grave dressed up as thrift. He'd have said the same to a king. Mara let them talk, and kept forking bedding. Then the first thing she had not planned for showed itself, low along the back wall, dark and spreading. The seep. She found it the next morning, and she found it by looking, not by luck. A stain had crept up the earthen back wall a hand's width overnight, dark and cold to the touch, and where it met the packed floor the bedding had gone to sour mud. She crouched and put 2 fingers to it and smelled them. Groundwater. Not roof leak, the roof read dry and true. This came from behind, out of the hill itself, the winter ground pushing its moisture toward the one warm hollow she'd opened in it. Vance had stayed the night at the near homestead and rode back to watch. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Wet floor, 6 stock, that was the whole prophecy come true before noon. But Mara was already reading the stain like a page. The water wasn't falling, it was wicking, climbing the wall by the same thirst that pulls oil up a lamp wick, drawn to the dry warmth inside. Stop the wick and you stop the seep. She'd cut her back wall too clean, too smooth, given the water a straight road in, so she broke the road. She dug a narrow trench along the foot of the back wall, a hand deep, and canted the floor toward it a half-inch, so any water that came would run to the trench instead of into the bedding. Then she led the trench out along the low side, to daylight through a clay pipe she pitched downhill. Give the water a lower, easier place to go, she reasoned, and it will not climb to the higher, harder one. She packed the trench mouth with a plug of straw and coarse sand, coarse, so the water passed but the bedding didn't fall in. By evening the back wall had stopped darkening, by morning it had begun, faintly, to dry. Vance came and looked at the drying wall a long while. He didn't like it. It bothered him more than the wet had. A wet wall fit his figures, a dry one did not, and a man who trusts his figures is unsettled worst by the thing that beats them. He rode off without a word, and Mara understood she'd made an enemy of arithmetic itself. Then the land agent's letter came, folded twice, official, and the threat put on its first face. It was not a threat with a voice yet, it was a clause. The note on her quarter section carried an improvement covenant, the agent wrote, and to hold the land past spring she must show a permanent structure of demonstrable value upon it. A house in the ground, the letter implied without quite saying, might not count as a structure at all. She read it twice by the stove and set it under the chalk-line reel and went out to the cut, because worry with your hands is better than worry without. She'd solved the seep, and the fix for the seep had quietly opened the door to the thing that would nearly kill everything. Because to cut the drainage trench, she'd banked the floor and packed the low vents tighter with sand against splash. And in doing it she had, without meaning to, choked her own low channels, narrowed the very inlets that fed the barn its cold, heavy, living air. She did not know it yet. The animals knew it first. It showed in Juno. The cow grew dull over 3 days, slow to the manger, her breath coming shallow and quick where it should come deep and slow. The 2 shoats grew logy. Mara thought first of fever, then of bad feed, and found neither. She stood in the middle of her own barn at dusk, lantern up, and could not name what was wrong, and the not naming frightened her more than any wet wall. That was when Dr. Callum Reyes rode into the draw, sent for by a neighbor over a foundered mare, and heard the widow had put her whole herd underground. He came out of professional suspicion, not neighborliness. Reyes was a veterinary man, trained in Kansas City, and he had watched more than one hopeful settler suffocate a shed full of stock behind a well-meant tight-shut door. He had grown up the 4th son on a Missouri dairy where his father sealed the cowhouse against the cold each winter, and lost a beast to the close sickness near every year, and had gone to his schooling half to answer why. The answer, he'd learned, was that animals in a shut space breathe out something the air can hold only so much of, and warm dead air holds it worst, and a barn could be dry and fed and warm and still, quietly, be a killing box. He expected to find exactly that here. He half hoped to, the way any man hopes to be proven right. He walked the length of the cut without a word. He put his hand to Juno's flank and counted her breaths against his watch. He held the lantern flame near the low vents and watched it. Then he crouched at the sand-choked inlets and looked at them a long time. "You closed these," he said. "Against splash," Mara said. "The drain." He didn't argue. He pulled the sand plug from the nearest low vent with his bare fingers, packed it looser, coarser, and held the flame to it again. The flame leaned in. Fresh air moved. He did the same at the second and the third, and then he set a wedge of shingle under each plug to keep the water off without stopping the air. "Cold falls in. Bad air climbs out your high hole," he said, not to her exactly. "You had it. Then you shut the door on your own chimney." He didn't say well done. He repaired her logic and let the repair be the compliment. By morning Juno pulled deep breaths again and went to her manger. And Mara had learned the second force by nearly losing to it. The closed air, the silent one, the one you cannot see coming until it has already begun. Rhea stayed 2 days and came back once a week after, without being asked. The agent came in person the second time, and the threat put on its second face, no longer a clause but a proceeding. He was a narrow, courteous man named Fenwick, and he brought a surveyor and a printed form. He was not there to argue, he was there to file. He walked the mouth of the cut, wrote figures, and told her plainly that his office would be entering a finding that the improvement on the land was an excavation, not a structure, and therefore no improvement in law. She would have until the spring court to answer it. He tipped his hat when he left. Fenwick was, if anything, sorry, but the paper he served did not care whether he was sorry, and neither did the ground. Mara stood in the cut after he'd gone and took up the chalk-line reel and turned it over and over in her hands. She thought, A barn that keeps stock alive should be structure enough for any man. She thought it, and did not believe the law would agree, and set the reel down and went back to work, because the third force was still waiting, and she knew it. She had beaten the seep. She had beaten the closed air. What she could not beat, not in the weeks she had left, was the settle. She saw it in a hairline. A crack had opened in the sod overhead near the mouth, thin as a thread, running crosswise to her ridgepole. The buried roof was doing what buried roofs do. The great weight of the sodden autumn earth was pressing down, and the frost coming into the ground was heaving it, and the two together worked the timbers by a hair each day. Her 1 in 3 pitch shed most of the load into the ridge. But near the mouth, where the earth ran thinner over the doorframe, the load turned downward, and there it wanted to sag. Winardogyo. She shored what she could. She sistered a second beam under the worst of the crack and drove wedges. It slowed the sag. It did not stop it. To truly fix it she'd have needed to strip and rebuild the whole front span with more earth and a steeper pitch, and that was a summer's work, and she had days. It'll hold light snow, she told Reyes, plainly, no drama in it. A hard load, over the mouth, given time, that span will come down. She said it the way you report the weather. Then she went back to wedging, because a thing half solved is better than a thing not touched. The boy did the small thing that would matter, in those same days, and no one marked it. Emery was 9 and given to fixing what didn't need fixing. He'd taken a length of stovepipe from the scrap and bored it full of holes with a nail, up and down its whole length, because he'd seen his mother make the high vent and wanted a vent of his own. She'd told him it was junk and to keep it out of the stalls. He'd hidden it in the far stall, the one Juno wouldn't use, and he kept a record besides, a slate where he chalked the barn's warmth each dawn from the little spirit thermometer Reyes had left, a number a day, in a 9-year-old's crooked hand. The snow began on a Tuesday, in the afternoon, gray and quiet and wrong. It did not come like weather, it came like a lid. By dark the wind had found its voice, and by midnight the draw was gone. No ridge, no fence, no near homestead, only white driving flat and hard enough to sand the paint off a door. Mara had the stock in, and the doors barred, and the boy asleep in the near stall in the warm. Then the pounding came on the plank door, out of the storm. It was the surveyor from Fenwick's party, half frozen and wild. Their sledge had gone off the trace 2 miles out. Fenwick was down in the snow with a broken leg, and Alder Vance, who'd ridden out to guide them and gloat over the dugout one more time. Vance had his team foundered, and 3 other souls with him in a drift, going cold fast, and the near homestead's roof had already stove in under the load. 30-odd people, before the night was done, would come off that broken road and out of those buried homesteads to the one door in the draw that the storm could not reach. Mara did not make a speech. She pulled on Tom's coat and lit the lantern. She left the boy the warm and went out into the white. She found the sledge by the surveyor's rope and the sound of a horse. She got Fenwick's arm over her shoulder. His leg was bad. She dragged more than carried him, 100 yards that took an hour, the cold a hand pressing on her chest. She went back for the next, then the next. Vance she found last, on his feet, keeping the others moving in a circle, which was the only thing between them and sleep. He saw her lantern. He didn't speak. He took the far side of the weakest man, and they hauled together toward the dark mouth in the ridge that his own arithmetic had condemned. Inside, the barn took them all. Cold air fell in the low vents and did not stop. The bodies and the stock and the 2 small stoves warmed the space, and the warmth climbed, and it climbed toward the high channel at the back, and went out into the storm, and fresh came in behind it, over and over, the chimney of it breathing steady, while the world outside could not breathe at all. 30 people and the stock in a hole in the ground, and the air stayed sweet. The seep ran quiet to its trench. 2 forces held. The third began to fail near dawn. The load came down the way she'd said it would. The wind had stacked a drift 6 feet deep over the mouth of the cut in a single night, all of it dead weight on the thin span above the doorframe, and the frost had done its lifting underneath, and near first light the hairline crack over the mouth opened with a sound like a shot. The sistered beam bowed, sod sifted down in a curtain. Everyone at the front end of the barn was suddenly under the one span that could not hold. Mara got them back. She moved 30 people toward the deep end, toward the near stall, toward Juno's corner, where the earth ran thickest overhead, the far stall, the one the cow had never once entered, and the far stall was where the air went bad first. Packed with bodies now, its low vents were fewer, and its one high channel too small for the crowd of breath, and within minutes the lantern flame there began to shrink and gutter, and men began to yawn and sag who should have been afraid. The closed air, in the one corner the settle had driven them to. The 2 forces she'd beaten had joined the one she hadn't, and cornered them all in the safest seeming place in the barn. Reyes saw the flame die low, and shouted for air, for a vent, for anything. There was no time to bore one. The auger was up front, under the failing span. Then the boy remembered his junk. Emery dragged the stovepipe out from where he'd hidden it in that very stall, the length of pipe he'd bored full of holes with a nail, because he'd wanted a vent of his own. Mara understood it in a breath. She jammed one end into the small high channel to widen its throat and swung the whole length out low across the crowd, and the holes did what holes do. They gave the climbing bad air 100 small doors instead of one, and drew it up and out through the widened channel into the storm. The flames steadied, the yawning stopped, men who'd been sinking sat up. She'd told them the front span would fall, and it fell, and the earth over the deep end held, because the pitch there was true, and the air in the deep end held, because a 9-year-old had made a toy nobody wanted. 3 feet of ground let the deadliest night in the draw's memory pass over 30 souls and leave them breathing.
By full light the wind broke. They dug out the mouth by noon.
The front span had come down clean, a slump of sod and one snapped beam, exactly where she'd said it would go, and nowhere else. The deep end stood untouched. Nobody had died, every animal lived. Fenwick could not walk, so they carried him to the deep end to wait for the road to open, and there, propped against the wall his office had ruled, was not a structure. He watched 30 people warm themselves inside it. Later, when he could stand, Alder Vance did the inspecting, because he was the only one there who couldn't stop himself. He went down the length of the barn slow, touching things. He looked at the drainage trench and the dry wall above it. He looked at the low vents and the high channel and the hold stovepipe still jammed in its throat. He crouched at the fallen front span a long while, and read how it had come down, outward and forward, away from the stock, the way a thing fails when it's built to fail safe. He stood up and looked at the true deep end and the untouched pitch. He asked her one question. "The rise on this back roof," he said. 1 in 3. 1 in 3, she said. He nodded, slow. It was not an apology. It was a man taking a measurement he meant to use. Fenwick, hearing it, and looking at the 30 warm bodies his surveyor's frozen fingers were among, said quietly that his finding would need revising, that whatever the law called a hole in the ground, this one had improved the land by every soul standing in it. He would write it so. The clause resolved itself in the space of a breath, not because she'd argued, but because the barn had held. When the road opened and the others had gone, Mara took the chalk-line reel from its ledge. She'd carried it 2 years. She turned it in her hands one last time, feeling the bright worn place where Tom's thumb had lived. Then she called the boy over, and showed him how to hook the string to a nail, and let the weight fall, and read the true against the plumb, the way his father had read it, the way she had. She pressed the reel into his hands, and closed his fingers over the brass. She didn't tell him what it was, she said only, "It always tells you the truth, keep it honest." Then she went to fork the bedding, and left him standing in the mouth of the cut, snapping a blue line along a fresh beam, careful, tongue between his teeth, the reel already his. The barn survived 3 forces, and she could name them now the way a craftsman names her tools. The seep, she'd sent to a lower place than it wanted to climb. The closed air, she'd given a chimney, a low door and a high one, so the living breath could never sit still and sour. The settle she never fully beat, but she'd pitched the deep roof to shed the load into the ridge instead of down, and where it couldn't shed, she'd built it to fall away from the stock instead of onto them. Emery's slate proved the last of it. The little column of chalked numbers, 1 warmth a day, ran steady straight through the blizzard's night. The barn had never once gone cold. The record said so in a 9-year-old's hand. By spring the language of the draw had turned without anyone announcing it. At the store counter in Kettle Draw, a man buying seed asked the clerk whether the widow Holt would come out and look at his south slope before he set his new barn, and the clerk wrote the request in the day book under her name, plainly, as you'd write any tradesman's, Holt, ground barn, to advise. No one at the counter thought it strange. A year on, past the next hard winter, Mara came over the ridge with a bucket and stopped. Below her, in the lee of his own father's flat where Alder Vance had always said barns belonged, the Vance boy was on his knees in a fresh cut, boring a low channel into a hillside with an auger, unwatched, working it the way you work a stubborn cow. She stood a moment and said nothing, and went on. A house on the ground fights the winter, she thought. Down there, another one was learning to let it pass over.